A very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first session of Climate Governance Malaysia's Directors Masterclass Series 2025. I'm Avicenna, part of the CGM Secretariat team, and it's my pleasure to open today's session, Carbon Pricing and Markets, EU Insights and Implications for Malaysia. Building on the success of our 2024 series, the Directors Masterclass Series 2025 is a collaborative initiative aimed to further strengthen your understanding of climate-related issues while keeping you informed on the latest market trends and sustainability developments. We'd like to extend our appreciation to Bursa Malaysia and the Institute of Corporate Directors Malaysia for their support in making this session possible. Before we begin, we'd like to invite you to share your initial thoughts before the session by scanning the QR code on the screen. Feel free to leave the form open and submit after the masterclass has ended. Without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, founder, non-independent director, and council member of CGM, to deliver her welcoming remarks.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm really glad to see all of you here. To start with, I really must apologize for the mishaps. There have been difficulty logistically in us pulling off an in-person session, and we must apologize for that. And the EU delegation to Malaysia also apologizes for the various changes that we've had. But thank you so much for turning up. And remember, the session is recorded, so you'll be able to look at it later at your convenience. We're really, really fortunate to have someone senior like Renato participating in this session today. We're looking forward to hearing from him. I think in particular, he's very keen to talk to us about carbon pricing, Article 6 related discussions, voluntary carbon markets, how it has worked in the EU, what the challenges have been. And we're going to unpack this over the course of the next hour. I'm looking forward to your questions. Please share your questions in the Q&A box, not the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of it as possible. So right now, I'd like to hand this over to Renato for his opening remarks, please. Over to you, Renato.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good afternoon to all of you. It's my great pleasure to participate in this session of the Masterclass. As it was mentioned also from my side, apologies for not being able to be there in person, as that was the original plan. And what I'll do for these opening remarks, also because I would like also for you to get some takeaways and some additional materials after the masterclass itself. Allow me to share for the next 10-15 minutes maximum just some few extra information. I was also seeing that you were playing the video just before the masterclass started, so it's a short but also very informative video. So it touches upon several points that I will be mentioning also during my opening remarks. But in any case, I'm just going to start sharing my screen. And then we can go quickly through some of the points that I have here. And yeah, I think you should be able to see my screen by now. Can you confirm?
Yes, we can.
Okay, very good. So just very briefly, I will be quick through the slides, but as I said, just to give you some background. So I'm part of the recently created task force, and it's very important because it's a recent task force. So for some of you that might be less familiar, this is a recently created initiative. So it was about a year ago that this was created by as an initiative from the European Commission President and the Commissioner in charge. And as you can see here, some of the mandate that was given to myself and to my colleagues. The task force is now operationalized since last summer, and we do have a very strong focus in terms of proactively reaching out to third countries and jurisdictions about the domestic carbon pricing, and here in various forms, so carbon tax or ETS, international voluntary carbon markets, including Article 6, and also voluntary carbon markets. So this is basically the bulk of our daily work, and it was perceived by the European Commission as this was a gap in our diplomacy effort in terms of having a more specific technical group that would be able to support the reaching out on these specific areas, because there is a growing interest on carbon pricing and carbon markets. And so we needed to be equipped to have in-depth conversations on those topics. And that's the reason why this was created in the very first place. So we can offer several things, but I think just here, just as a background, so you can, at this stage, we don't need to enter too much into that, but just for reference, we hope that sessions like this one and the mission that I was preparing to Malaysia and the future follow-up missions can indeed strengthen the cooperation and would allow for mutual identification of opportunities and priorities for further collaboration at technical level, and the task force as that purpose. Also very important to note is that the EU ETS has to be put in context, because there's a broader EU climate policy architecture of which EU ETS is part of, but EU ETS doesn't exist in isolation. EU ETS is part of an important part of the policy toolkit. So just to give you that background and what for you to have some numbers, facts and figures about what EU ETS has been able to do over the last 20 years, close to 20 years now. So EU aims to achieve its climate neutrality. So when we are putting a price on carbon, this has to be absolutely aligned with our legislation and with the European Union climate law. And so the EU ETS has indeed a role to play to achieve our current 2030 target of at least 55%. Compared with 1990 levels. So it's part of our journey towards climate neutrality by 2050. The EU ETS itself covers sectors and several sectors, and those sectors achieved significant emission reductions. So 47.6% reductions below 2005 levels. And when we compare the decline of emissions of ETS-covered sectors just from 2022 to 2023, those covered sectors' emissions declined by 16.5%. So that's an important impact in our trajectory towards net zero, as I was explaining. This is also mainly explained during that period due to the strong decrease of electricity and power generation with the increasing intake of renewables and also improvements in energy efficiency. So, but as I said, this is part of other packages. And also when we think about ETS, we also need to take into account about what we call the effort sharing, that basically is about non-ETS covered sectors. But some of these sectors will also be part of the scope of the new ETS2, and also the land use and land use change in forestry. That is another aspect that it's very important in terms of carbon removal and sinks. And I believe that also this resonates quite well in the Malaysian context. So here you can see that one of the big challenges when you have an EU ETS and you have a climate target and a political objective is to demonstrate how EU ETS has contributed also for the emissions, for the decoupling of emissions and economic growth. And what you can see in this slide is that indeed over time, over the last years, EU has experienced a consistent decoupling from economic growth and emissions reductions. So in 2023, the emissions already fall by 37%, and the economy in the same period grew around 68%. This is quite important when you have at least 36% of the emissions covered under this system. So the EU ETS has an impact, it has a contribution to that trajectory. So this puts EU on the path to climate neutrality, but of course more needs to be done, and we need to keep the high level of ambition. So as you see, the EU is in the process of now with the recommendations from the European Commission and part of the internal process preparing for the next NDC and to define what the 2040 target will look like. This is part also of the climate policy package. As I mentioned, here are some of the latest developments. So we need to keep working constantly on multiple fronts, not just on the pricing, but on reviewing legislation, setting up new targets, coming up with new rules and new additional pieces of regulation that go beyond the ETS itself, but also looking at the support measures. So it was mentioned also in the video, the impact of the Social Climate Fund, but also there are other elements related with the redistributive effects of an ETS that can promote innovation, competitiveness, and also allow for further modernization of the infrastructures. So here's some quick lessons learned from the ETS. So as I explained to you that it's working, it's contributing to the overall goal, is reducing emissions within the system itself, but also it's a system that is in continuous process of evolution. So it's not a static system. So for the last 20 years, the UETS has gone through different phases, and they started until prior to 2024, to last year, with coverage that included electricity and its generation, and also industrial manufacturing and aviation, but that scope has been expanded. So we have quite important lessons to share with you. Importance of having an accurate and transparent MRV. This is quite important, and so something that we strongly incentivize the Malaysian authorities to consider is to set up good foundations, even if in the future the system is not an emissions trading, if it's a carbon tax. Monitoring and reporting data is the backbone of a system. So this is one of our experience, and the MRV system has been improving over time as well in terms of the reporting guidelines. It's important to keep a high level of flexibility in the system to guarantee that it works, guarantee that the system is resilient to external shocks. And when you have a financial crisis, when you have a war scenario, when we have other sort of external factors, the pricing keeps working and keeps driving emission reductions. So it's important that the system is fair for those that are in, but also is fair in terms of avoiding unintended consequences for the most vulnerable groups. And so that's why a set of funds have been put together with ETS to make it work better. So it's important also that it's aligned with a cap and with a political target, because otherwise there's no true impact that can be measured as part of the policy toolkit. So what you can see here in this slide is that the importance of aligning the cap, and because we have a decreasing cap and we have a linear reduction factor, you can see over time in this time horizon towards 2030 that it's really helping to decline our emissions in a consistent way. A few more things here important of the use of revenue, so that the transition from free allocation towards auctioning, and also here is a set of reforms. And in this set of reforms, here just highlighting the most recent, as I was mentioning, there were reforms over periods of time, so between phases 1, 2, 3, 4, but these are some of the most recent. And I would like to highlight the inclusion of maritime transport since last year, and the preparation for the new ETS2 that is going to be formally starting. Now we're still in the preparation stages, but formally starting from 2027 onwards. There is also an increasing amount of auctioning and reduction of free allocation. There is the inclusion of CBAM as a way to deal with the carbon leakage, and also important of keeping a stable carbon price, and this can be achieved via the market stability reserve. So there's some information in the deck that you can read afterwards about what MSR is and how it functions, but also important here before we close these opening remarks, that you can see how some of these funds, the set of funds, is expected to be channeling these revenues that are generated, these additional revenues that are generated to drive faster and further the green transition in EU. So with different purposes for different target groups. There's also information about CBAM, but I think we can also go a little bit further during the Q&A about what CBAM is, and it's not what is intended to do, what is expected to do, and how it's going to work. And that's it for my opening remarks. I think really want to give you like a overview, putting you in a nutshell what is a very complex piece of policy, but at the same time something that has been working and contributing for the last 20 years for the decarbonization of European economy. And with that, I will stop my slide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Renato. That's a short, brief, but good overview. Thank you so much. So let's dive into some questions now. I think we've already got some questions in the Q&A, but I am the moderator, so I have the first go with you.
Yes.
So you touched on this already, CBAM. Now, obviously, I think a lot of parties understand that the EU sets climate ambition in the world. It is the most ambitious, and that's something to be aspiring to. At what stage, and of course, EU does not want to be accused of outsourcing your emissions or deforestation to countries that are not managing their emissions or managing the deforestation. We understand that. But at what stage does this sustainability ambition then become so anti-competitive that perhaps some form of trade barriers need to be raised? And what is the attitude of the Commission for this? So something like CBAM, for example, is it reducing leakage or is it anti-trade barrier? How do you have an impact on competitiveness while balancing sustainability goals? What are your thoughts on this, Renato?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed. CBAM is something that it's new. It's new for everyone. It's new for the European Commission, and it's new for everybody around the world. So we are going through a process of learning by doing. Also noting that the EU at the moment is not the only jurisdiction that is in the process of setting up its own CBAM. There's other initiatives. There is UK also in process of putting a CBAM. Also, in the region within ASEAN, there's also Thailand also expressed recently also an interest in terms of considering its own CBAM. And so we think that this is something that over time seems more of a trend that will have an impact and needs to be taken into account in terms of how the global value chains function and how the price of carbon is factored in. As you mentioned, the EU is indeed at the forefront of these international efforts in terms of fighting climate change. But the objective of the CBAM, again, as a measure, is in a way first is designed with the aim of being WTO compatible. So from that point of view, being compliant is a new mechanism. So it has its own complexities. At the same time, it has to be proportional, and so it's something that. As of today, I'm not able to tell you much more about that, but I believe that you also have been following the news. So in the next few days, European Union is also considering about a package of a very comprehensive package of legislation related with the simplification of certain rules and principles that will indeed move towards that more proportional type of measures. So we need all to wait for these measures to be disclosed in the next few days. But I think just to give you an indication, that's also an important aspect to consider. So we don't want to overcomplicate, and we need to make sure that there is an element of fairness. As I mentioned, in the EU ETS itself, element of fairness is very important. So this element of fairness needs to be extended, and it's not about treating producers of products from the CBAM cover sectors differently from the same producers of the same products are treated within the EU. So it's about giving equal treatment for that to create the level playing field, and also the coverage is the same. So it's again, there's no covering more in terms of scope or sectors via the CBAM that would be covered within the ETS itself. At the same time, the signals that have been received, because the EU has also established formally and informally policy dialogues about CBAM preparation at the country level or at regional level, but this is something that it's flagged by the countries themselves if they have an interest. So specifically also with Malaysia, if there's further interest, we can also further explore more dialogue, because this dialogue is extremely useful to facilitate and to enable the implementation. Is to say that what we are seeing, generally speaking, is that this is creating a strong signal, and a lot of jurisdictions around the world are also considering stepping up their own ambition. And CBAM has been playing a role in that. It's not the only factor to consider, because we have to acknowledge that several jurisdictions are considering putting prices on carbon and these intents were prior to the CBAM itself, but CBAM is giving a new boost. So I think that's also an important factor to consider in terms of raising the level of ambition and incentivizing via this mechanism more jurisdictions to decarbonize, and also because this system is not country specific. That's also a very important aspect. This is related with products and sectors, products from those sectors covered by CBAM. Yeah, I think I will stop here. Of course, we could have a full session on CBAM. I'm pretty sure, but just to give you some extra lines, and very happy to follow up afterwards.
You know, Renato, I want to probe that a little bit more. I hear what you're saying. And I agree that this could be your perspective. And of course, the philosophy is that if you have products that are cheaper, faster, better, and better for the environment, low carbon footprint, for example, then it is a competitive advantage. But if you have trading partners that haven't even mandated emissions reporting, that don't really have robust net zero strategy, for example, or are still looking at emissions intensity as a target, not absolute emissions, then can you see that this could be viewed as being anti-competitive, where the gap between your ambition and your trading partners is so big? And then if, as you have pointed out, if we have what you call this gap in diplomacy efforts, such as with EUDR, if the gap is too big, then you end up in a situation where you legislate something and then have to suspend it because the gap is too big, right? Although everybody
Yes.
understands the philosophy, but in terms of
Yes.
action on the ground, if we haven't even mandated emissions reporting, how are we going to work together on this? And of course, countries all around the world are grappling with the same problems. We all want to price this negative externality, and yet in almost every country, for example, fuel at the pump is still subsidized. So even dismantling that subsidy, and you will come across this in EU, is going to be difficult. So it's not so straightforward as just wanting to price, although I acknowledge the ETS seems to have been very successful. What do you think? What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, it's not straightforward. I agree with you, and so that's why there is a process now in terms of the of the upcoming legislative acts that need to follow to actually implement the CBAM. And so what the EU is doing is conducting these studies, is analyzing different systems and different contexts around the world in terms of whether there is an explicit price on carbon or there is not, and under which forms and shapes. Also, there are some discussions related with different price levels that are applied across different jurisdictions. So particularly for the colleagues from DG TaxUD, that is the Director General from the European Commission in charge of the design and implementation of this policy, they are following those steps. So I think that it's very important. What you mentioned, it's being acknowledged. Also, this element, what I said, like this diplomacy gap in terms of supporting third countries in implementing carbon pricing, it's also part of this process. So one is identifying that there are gaps, there are differences, there is a process, and not everybody is at the same step right now. But we then through this analysis and identifying what can be done now, what can be done later, how this is a phased system, because CBAM as such is not going to be fully implemented. So there is a trajectory for gradually phasing out free allocation and then phasing in CBAM. So that's an important aspect, that gradual aspect. And so in the next 10-year scenario that we're talking about here, close to that, we have a role to play and a work to do together with the third countries in these efforts of convergent that are proportional. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thank you. So that was my first question, balancing sustainability ambition with the perception of being anti-competitive against the backdrop of this gap in diplomacy. So my next question was looking forward. Net zero by 2050 is to limit warming to 2 degrees, keep pathways open for the end of the century. And we know that 76 years earlier, last year, we've already hit 1.5 degrees of warming. Now, of course, we can wait for long-term average, but we know that every subsequent year, well, January was the hottest January on record. Every subsequent year, we seem to be hitting new targets. What is the EU's contribution to this discussion? The new climate modeling, the overshoot climate model, and so on and so forth. Because IPCC obviously has to get a consensus across over 190 countries and jurisdictions. The EU is smaller, and while the perception may be that there has been a pause in the EU while you're looking and re-looking at competitiveness, but the EU is still the flag bearer here. So how are you shaping new baselines in climate policy?
Okay. Yeah. So EU indeed. So the objectives in terms of the EU climate policy ambition are still intact, and the EU is developing his next climate target and preparing for the submission of the NDC within the objectives of Paris Agreement target, knowing that the objectives are very ambitious, and it will depend on the collective level of ambition to get there or stay within the 2 degrees, because as some NDCs already being submitted, and we can always hope for more ambition, and sometimes the ambition is not that at that level, and we know that we are losing time, and time is a precious factor in this equation, because less than now or soon means that more and at a higher cost might have to be done later, and eventually putting the world in a trajectory that it's not recoverable in terms of meeting the Paris Agreement objectives. So EU stays on course in terms of the political objectives. And nothing has changed in terms of the level of ambition. So there's currently an internal discussion to prepare for the 2040 targets and the NDC, the next NDC that will be presented ahead of the next COP, but of course there was a new deadline, and so this will be presented within that time frame. What is quite important is that, as I mentioned before, also in my introductory remarks, these objectives are quantified. So there is a process of an internal impact assessment to understand what kind of targets we need to achieve in different policies to meet our climate neutrality target, and to guarantee that what is being proposed in the NDC will be something that is realistic and it's achievable, because it's very important to give that signal. So this process is ongoing. There is the European climate law, because the European climate law it's something that makes the whole objectives that are set up mandatory within European Union. So this legally binding objective within EU itself. So it's quite important to make sure that we keep that momentum. And it was about a year ago, in February 2024, the Commission published its recommendation. So it was flagged, and it has been publicly available. So that the proposal from the European Commission was a proposal for a possible target of 90% emission reductions. So it's an important step compared with the Fit for 55, from the 55% reductions by 2030 that will go down. That's the proposal. Again, it's not agreed, by 90% by 2040. So to put us in that trajectory, there's a lot to be done. So there is not only the role of the carbon price and the carbon markets, but there's new pieces of legislation that need to come in. There is existing legislation that needs to be even more ambitious, and it needs to go through a review cycle, as it was the case to meet the 2030 target. So all of that, there is eventually a higher role that the carbon removals and carbon things will have to play. As you understand, currently the 2030 target is being achieved only domestically, so without the use of international credits. So to achieve a higher level of ambition, it has to be considered whether or not this will only be the 2040 target will only be achieved domestically, or if not, is going to be to what extent with the use of international credit. So that it's part of a big and broader discussion with lots of modeling exercises and analytical exercises, impact assessment, etc., etc. This element of competitiveness and innovation is something that it's now, I would say, not being added on top. Is not that the EU doesn't want to be competitive or innovative before as a space, but is even more important because the new generation of climate policies need to take that into account. So it's not about greening the economy, but greening and staying innovative, and greening and staying competitive domestically and internationally. So it's also very important message from our side to other jurisdictions that are navigating through these complex waters, that it's a dynamic process and it needs to factor in. So it's not basically coming up with climate architecture that prevents innovation, prevents growth, and prevents competition, but as an enabling factor, as a new factor of growth of those economies. So that's kind of the logic behind it, and that's what the European Union is. Our European Union is going to contribute in terms of the new climate models towards 2050, and in this case, I think that also in the trajectory now from Baku to Berlin, so from COP29 to COP30. So different colleagues, not from my team, but from the climate negotiators and other colleagues, are also very active, engaging with different parties to work on the different negotiation streams to make sure that the enabling conditions. It's also very important when it's look at the global stock taking, at everything that what is on the table. It's putting us, as I said in the beginning, in the right direction and not in the deviation, increasing the deviation from that pathway.
Yeah. That's such an interesting point you raised, because I think at the beginning, although we recognize we lived in a globalized world, but the thinking really was that if I can manage emissions within my borders, credits within my borders, I communicate with my trading partners what my expectations are, that's the end of it. But now, and especially with so many countries drawing up the drawbridge, as it were, and becoming more domestic focused, I think it's becoming even more critical that we're using all the policies, all the tools in our arsenal to be able to influence and engage. And of course, the EU has gone down the path of diplomatic engagement like this, sending people out to communicate, to explain, and to rationalize. But how do you see this in light of trading partners reversing their stance on climate ambition? How do you see the EU being able to influence them, where you have trading partners who are saying this is just not important to me any longer, while the EU is trying to increase its ambition even more, come up with climate modeling for an overshoot scenario, for example, and you have trading partners who are saying, this is just not important. I need to look after my domestic economy. Well, what are your, I know we're going far from carbon pricing, but these are some of the levers that you need to be comfortable with.
Yes, indeed. But so when some of these partners, of course, the world is complex, is made of different and many countries, and also that have different political cycles. So it's something that it's unavoidable, and there's geopolitical complexities. But for what the EU has been doing, we have data and we have information, and that this is not going to create economic problems to our economy. The other way around, we see that there is a growing trend that for the transformation of the economy, this is the way to go, is direction. So that's what I was saying in the previous question that you were asking me, that the EU stays in course of meeting its targets and keeping its ambition. So of course, when you have these situations, particularly with big political actors, it's legitimate that the countries and people, generally speaking, think, okay, shall we reconsider? And we reflect on this in terms of making sure that we optimize the toolkit, but actually in terms of competitiveness, innovation, investment, attractiveness of European Union as a space for green transition and innovation. I believe that it can also be an opportunity, because when others are going in a different direction, there is probably
competitive advantage.
exactly
Okay.
of staying in course.
All right. My final set of questions before we turn to questions in the Q&A box. We've already had so much difficulty in pricing carbon, just one metric, right? And part of the challenge with Malaysia is that we are a relatively small contributor to historic emissions, 0.4%. Our emissions per capita are really high. We could even be an Annex 1 country. We recognize that. But even more importantly, I feel, is that there are only 17 countries of mega biodiversity in the world. We have a long marine coastline. You must come and visit us one day, Renato, when you get your passport sorted out. We have a long marine coastline, and so we have marine biodiversity as well. And so we are a country of mega biodiversity, and we are a steward of this biodiversity. So I wanted to ask you, how can we apply lessons learned from measuring, reporting on, and verifying one metric, such as greenhouse gas emissions, to biodiversity credits, right? How, for example, how can we align ASEAN's voluntary carbon markets with incentives for reforestation, protecting our carbon sinks? How can we explore biodiversity credits as a potential source of income, for example? What are your thoughts? What are the lessons that we can learn if we were to start on this?
No, that's very interesting question, and I think it applies perfectly, as you said, in the Malaysia context. So just for the record, I have visited Malaysia before a few times, but not this time. I couldn't make it because I visited in Langkawi and then in other parts in Penang, in other parts of Malaysia, and I recognize the rich biodiversity of your country. So looking forward to go back. And for the EU, I think we are indeed very, very favorable to what you said, like the use of either biodiversity co-benefits, because, for example, there is a possibility in the context of international carbon markets and voluntary carbon markets to look at these additional co-benefits. So it's the process of basically, okay, you are developing a project related with the carbon credits, but then you get additional biodiversity co-benefits on top. This is excellent, because this is also, if this is part of the high integrity of those projects and those credits, this is an add-on. It's very important. But on the other hand, also EU, and this is not within DG Clima, is within DG Environment, we have been working also separately and beyond the carbon credits and carbon market itself, in terms of the biodiversity credits, how these credits and these assets can also be monetized in a way that it enables the protection of biodiversity and the increasing of biodiversity. So it's basically these two dimensions. One, where there is a market where carbon credits can have an add-on of biodiversity elements, and the biodiversity market that is also growing in itself. And particularly, as you say, if this helps, both of them should help in terms of the valorization of the conservation of the ecosystems. So it's quite important. What we think it should be careful is that developing carbon pricing projects that put biodiversity at risk, that should not go ahead, because basically it would, even if it is just creating a net benefit or creating a debit, it's not good. It's not good. So it's very important for biodiversity-rich countries that, with the aim of developing carbon markets, you don't undermine your own biodiversity. But it should be the other way around. Should be an incentive.
Okay.
Just one last point on that very quickly before we move on. So EU is developing also within EU its own legislation for carbon removals and things, and also how domestic credits can be used in that context. So I think what could be interesting in terms of lessons learned is engaging with some of those colleagues that are behind this piece of legislation and furthering the dialogue, because I believe that in the process, of course, the type of forests and the type of biodiversity is different, but some of the legislative hurdles might be quite similar and worth sharing with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think part of the challenge is within ETS, the units are fungible, right? But the moment you go down to nature-based solutions, each carbon credit might not necessarily be fungible because it's also funding all sorts of other ancillary projects. For example, with the Aboriginal people, perhaps with rural electrification by solar, and so on and so forth. So once each unit doesn't become fungible, it's then very difficult to have comparability or to even price it accurately. And if you're going to layer on biodiversity on top of that, because some areas are just so rich in biodiversity, and by its definition, it's going to be varied, then that reduces the comparability. Then it's certainly not fungible anymore. So these are some of the challenges that we're facing in protecting carbon sinks. But you're right, maybe we should reach out to the other departments in the EU who are attending to this. Okay, so let's take questions from our Q&A box now. I'm going to assume that the person has Googled and understands now what MRV stands for. Let's go to the next question. How does CBAM help EU ETS reduce its free allowance allocation? So they want to understand the difference between phase in and free allocation phase out. Would you be able to walk us through that?
Yes. So so until now, in the absence of CBAM, there is just to be clear, the majority of EU allowances that are distributed in the system at the moment are distributed via auctioning. So they are not free. There's no free allocation for those. The market participants that need those allowances, they go to the marketplace, participate in an auction, and they buy, make bids and buy at market prices. But some of the sectors that have been considered over these last years as carbon leakage exposed sectors, those sectors, to prevent that carbon leakage, and carbon leakage, just to clarify, maybe some of you might not, carbon leakage means that if a jurisdiction has a price on carbon and a jurisdiction, either neighboring country or on the other side of the world, doesn't have a carbon price, and in the fact, due to that, that creates an economic incentive for for example, for diverting investments or from one place to another place. This is what is generally called carbon leakage. So to prevent that, so basically some export-led industries, products have been in that list. So with CBAM, because CBAM creates that level playing field in terms of sectors and products, so putting in the same level the internalizing the price, carbon price levels for the explicit carbon price for those produced in Europe, produced outside Europe. That's within that trajectory that you can then gradually, not from this year into next year, but over a longer period of time, phase out the free allocation, because it would not be free or would not be fair. I mean, that you would impose a price at the border for the products and would continue giving free allocations to the producers of the same products. That would be a big distortion of trade. Yeah, so that's the logic behind it. I hope I made it clear.
Okay, so I mean, we've answered the question, but if you need any clarifications, please put it into the Q&A box again, okay?
Yes, yes, exactly. And then you can also reach out to me because again, I have slides for that. I have additional information for most of these questions, or
Okay,
in cases I don't, I can also happily put you in touch with other colleagues that follow certain sets of policies.
brilliant. Thank you so much, Renato. Has EU ETS been used as a benchmark policy in any of the Asian countries?
Okay, this one. So I would probably not call it as a benchmark in the sense that it's also an important role of the task force these days, because before the task force, of course, as part of the EU diplomacy efforts, and I was personally working on this topic in China for several years, and a lot of the discussion in the making of process of making the China ETS, first in the pilots and then in the national ETS, was
Mm.
modeled and supported by the experience of the EU ETS. But what I want to make clear is that it's not about exporting a model, exporting a EU ETS as such, and having like a jurisdiction being China, being Indonesia, being Vietnam, for example,
Mm.
applying as such. ETS has to be designed and implemented, taking into account the local context and the local specificities of the country that is implementing that. But what I can say, it has been a very good benchmark, for example, in areas of monitoring, reporting, and verification. So the robustness of the MRV. So because EU made a long progress over the last 20 years in improving that. So new countries that are using this as a benchmark can definitely learn much faster and do much better if they pick up
Mm.
on some of those elements. The systems now are much more complex, so there's no need to start designing emissions trading from scratch and repeating some of
Mm.
the errors of the past when you already
Mm.
have 20 years of accumulated experience. So
Yeah.
these are some quite important aspects there. There was some discussions also, for example, about the stability reserve. What is a stability reserve and why it's needed? The UETS didn't have one before, and this created a lot of problems because the system back then, without a stability reserve, was extremely vulnerable to external factors and external shocks. And so now the new designs of systems in across ASEAN also more keen to consider from the outset this type of mechanisms as part of the design because of the EU experience.
Yeah, that's a brilliant point. Yeah. Um, as an aside, for a country that hasn't even started with mandating emissions reporting, what is the process that you think a country should look at? What are the first steps that they should start looking at?
Yeah, I think that is very crucial. The emissions reporting, because the experience, for example, in the UETS in phase one, and
Yeah,
that's the phase one of UETS, the prices at the end of that phase tend towards zero because there was not possibility of banking, meaning transferring the allowances from that first phase into the following phase, but also because there was an over allocation, there was an excess of allowances in the system. And the main reason for that was because there was no prior data, no prior monitoring of the emissions of the installation. So it was when they
mm,
entered the system that this data started being collected systematically, and
mm,
then
mm.
it was verified that the emissions that have been distributed were excessive. So
Excessive, yeah.
what I advise, and again, giving the example of China, when China started the pilots, started monitoring and reporting earlier. And so they get sets of data that they could use for the pilots. But now in the national ETS, for example, first they start the monitoring and reporting for power sector. Power sector is part of the system. After they start monitoring and reporting for other sectors like cement, aluminium, iron and steel, chemicals. So these sectors already been monitoring their data for a couple of years in a systematic manner. The competent authorities are collecting those data, are analyzing those data, and this will be a very important foundation to design policies and then
Mm,
policy
mm,
design.
mm,
So I would
mm.
say that data collection is a very, and monitoring is a very important step and is a reality check of the profile of emissions of the energy intensive emissions or the less. So what you want, as you said, is a very small percentage of the global emissions in Malaysia, but also like what we have been doing in Europe for 20 years, and the EU is only now slightly less than 7% of the global emissions. So it's still we have to do our efforts. So it's very important to know the data before anything else.
So especially in a small open trading economy like Malaysia, we
Yes.
might think that the problem is our utility company or a national oil and gas company, but we do have landfills that are generating methane, and landfills are a big problem in Asia, from Mumbai to Manila. And we do have palm oil mill effluent ponds, which also generate methane. We have rotting biomass if large hydro is created. So there's other sources of emissions reporting that we need to keep track of as well.
Exactly.
So the
I
next
think
question.
that's balancing very well, because if you get the big picture, then you understand. Okay, well, how much emissions come from the industrial side, from the power sector side, from the land use, and then you will be able to devise a more solid strategy, a more solid policy
which has a
package
better
that will
impact.
address it.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. And so I think our next question sort of like touches on, because the first phase, as you said, there was a surfeit of allowances, right? So the question is, EU has been enjoying free allowance allocation, which is again a misnomer, since the inception of EU ETS to a majority of high emitting sectors. So this is what the case in the phase one, right?
Yes.
And so the question is, how is this fair to your trading partners? But I think post phase one, this has been clamped down. But maybe you want to just walk
Yes.
us through this again. Yeah.
Yes. So basically, that the free allocation is a small percentage of the European Union allocation. So the majority of the allocation currently in the system is via auctioning, and and um, and so this is, as I said, the parties, the covered entities will have to pay the price to get their allowances. They don't come to them for free. Also, it's also, this is an important dynamic looking at international markets. Again, I'm going to refer to my experience in China, because I was working in carbon markets there for 16 years. So it's also, I think it's quite relevant to share here. But in China, in the beginning, also there was this general approach that, okay, we need to start a system with free allocation, because we think that it's easier to get the market participants on board with free allocation, but we intend to increase gradually auctioning. And what we see with the UETS, and as I highlighted in some of my opening remarks, is that the auction revenues are increasing in EU, and now there's little to no resistance of having the auction in the market, because the auction itself creates an additional financial flow that is also helping not only the ETS sectors, but also helping the non-ETS sectors. So my general message there is that when designing these systems, for example, if it's an ETS there is a possibility of having ETS-specific revenues, how they can contribute to the decarbonization of the economy in Malaysia. But if you go through a process of a carbon tax, how these additional carbon tax revenues can also be earmarked somehow to support the Malaysian across the Malaysian economy and society in a different way, basically a generation of additional financial incentives to that.
I think it's super interesting and really relevant, because I know that EU and UK ETS carbon prices have reached $100 per ton before. That's a really high price, and not very many businesses will be able to pivot away from that. So I think that's really instructive when trading partners, industries, businesses are looking at shadow pricing carbon just to see what they can tolerate, what they're resilient towards. I think $100 per ton is quite alarming to many, many businesses.
Yes,
We have another
and the
question.
prices have been at that level, but then reduced a little bit. But again, in the future, the prices might be even higher. So you need basically to test the resistance points of the price.
Absolutely.
What is the new high?
Yeah. So there's a question about, I'm not sure if you know, but how would you describe where Malaysia is in terms of carbon credits trading? So this is more for voluntary carbon markets, not ETS. And what are the critical success factors that would facilitate a smooth marketplace transition? This is in your Q&A box. And I think the challenge is that, we tried to set up a carbon credit exchange. And I think there are issues not just on the demand side, on the supply side. So it's been a little bit bumpy. And so I think that's where this question is coming from. Like from an outsider looking at carbon credits trading, what are your thoughts on this?
Okay, let me share some thoughts here on that as well.
Yeah.
So I think
Okay.
that I've personally also been involved in some parts of the voluntary carbon markets over the years, and also back in the Kyoto Protocol days, I was also working with the CDM projects back then, etc. So I have that experience. I have seen throughout my career a lots of ups and downs in terms of the voluntary carbon markets, and it has been a bit of a roller coaster, I must say. And of course, it's very important. We know from private sector representatives here today that when you are in private sector, when you are investing, you need to have a predictability, you need to have certainty, you have to understand that there are certain signals that say, okay, it's worth for my company, for my group to consider going into this direction, investing in this voluntary carbon market, or staying away from it. Why is that? And so
Okay.
what I feel is also that particularly now, post Baku, and with some of the decisions that were agreed in Baku around Article 6, it might be a very important turning point, hopefully, because of course there is voluntary carbon market that goes beyond Article 6, but Article 6 of the Paris Agreement can indeed enable a carbon market cooperation, and it can enable this carbon market cooperation with a much more stringent set of rules that hopefully will contribute to bring up the ambition and to accelerate the action globally, but also making it in a way that pushes for the quality projects and the quality credits to come to the market, rather than focusing on the low standard, low quality, high volume ones, because those are the ones that in the past made a lot of headlines and undermined a lot of the credibility associated with voluntary carbon markets. So if something around carbon Article 6, being 6.2 or 6.4, but then it probably gets too specific for some colleagues in the audience, so just don't want to get too technical here. But we think that these corporations have to be fair and they have to be climate effective. So when countries like Malaysia are collaborating to deliver their Paris aligned the decarbonization trajectory, it's very important, because if you are on the buyer side, making sure that you are not deferring any necessary emission reductions that you will be required for your own Paris Agreement trajectory and your own carbon budget on the way to 2050, so that you are not selling upfront credits to a possible buyer that will I mean, from a seller side in case of Malaysia, but if you're not selling these to a buyer, that in the end of the day will undermine your own decarbonization trajectory. So this is valid for different buyer countries. So understanding where you are at and what are the short-term, medium-term, and long-term benefits, keeping in mind of that quality. And specifically, with the Article 6.4, we think that it can bring a significant quality improvement compared with some other existing standards. So it can somehow become a reference benchmark for voluntary carbon market and carbon trading in the future. So these are some of my thoughts. Just to summarize, I think that the Article 6 in itself, it's going to boost the integrity of voluntary carbon markets overall, if done correctly.
Well, what we're seeing more of is bilateral agreements. And what we're also seeing is it's difficult to agree to corresponding adjustments if we're not sure how much of the carbon, characteristics of the carbon sink we need for our own climate ambition. So I think this is part of the challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So the point was about seeing a lot of bilateral agreements, and that's taking place more, and the position on corresponding adjustments. So when we haven't even worked out what our ambition is, what the trajectory is, we might have an end date, let's say 2050, but we don't know when we're peaking, when we're halving, which are the large emissions intensive industries. And so then we can't really say or agree to corresponding adjustments until we have a far better picture, right? So I think a lot of countries are going to be in that bind.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So there is on that, just again, as I mentioned for other different points during my intervention. Also, we have some colleagues, not in my team, but within DG Clima, that
Okay.
are close to the climate, the negotiations of Article 6. And
Okay.
there are some ongoing projects that help to set up the capacity. And sometimes some of these projects, they look at the medium and long term, but we identify that there are indeed some short-term gaps and short-term needs for identifying some of the issues that you're just mentioning. So again, I can try to interconnect with you, some of you that are facing these questions with the colleagues there, because there might be some additional ways of looping you into some of the conversations, because as I said, the EU is not buying international credits, but we have a genuine interest in making sure that this works well for both buyers and sellers down the line. So yeah.
Okay. The next question is about warming. We're already at 1.5 degrees of warming. The estimate is 56% reduction in GHG emissions by 2035, and leading up to 90% reduction by 2050. So it's obvious the G20 countries are not doing enough. What are how is I know you're extending diplomatic efforts to countries like Malaysia, but what are you doing within the G20, between the largest polluting nations? How is the EU exerting its influence there? How are you going to get us across this finish line?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. So, just to tell you, with the G20 countries, and well, not all, but there are some countries, economies like Canada, United States, etc. These markets, they are not dealt with within the task force. They are dealt with another unit, but there are diplomacy efforts going on as well, and so. Even when the domestic policy is going through different directions, because you might see the current and the near future, medium long term trajectory in United States policy, but in the past there was some situations also in Canada, depending on the administration, in Australia. But for example, colleagues from the Commission have been just in Australia last week. They were in Japan last week. We are in very close contact with Brazil as the host of the next COP, and so there's I'll be in India myself in a week time. There will be a big mission from the European Commission, including the President, to India. So EU is really also working and concerned in terms of engaging the largest emitters and tackling those from the G20 group. That's absolutely, because nothing will be achieved without them. So it's very important. It's just about considering that the global picture. It might be that between winning and losing, and between achieving or not achieving, it's a global effort, and we know that it's not just about countries' effort. It's about sub national governments. It's about individuals. It's about different jurisdictions. So we all need to play our part. So that's part of the process. Yeah,
absolutely. And in terms of Gandhi's estimates, For example, cutting emissions by 56% by 2035, 90% reduction. How is the EU's modeling of what is needed now that we're on the verge of overshooting? What is the scale of the reduction that's needed? Is it possible to keep 1.5 alive, or do we need to scramble just to meet 2 degrees of warming now? What is your view on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not a modeler myself, but I work with modeling colleagues, and it's 1.5. We all know by now that it's quite challenging.
Right.
I don't want to say it's impossible. It depends in a lot of political will and immediate action that is rather late at the moment. But in DG Clima, we have also a unit that works on modeling, and again, because this kind of creates a lot of segmentation. So you remember that in my first opening remarks, I mentioned areas of cooperation. So all these areas, CMAM, Article 6, modeling
Yeah.
for policy making, are all areas where we can facilitate further discussion. So fortunately, we have good modeling resources within
Okay.
DG Clima that work also as
Brilliant.
part of international networks. And so if it's needed in the ASEAN context or in the Malaysian context to do something, I would be very happy to link you up with the modeling colleagues,
Oh,
because that's
please
that's
do.
what
Yeah.
that's what they do. Yeah, and
That's
it
what
is
they do.
absolutely,
Okay.
yeah.
I would love to hear more about that. So our
Okay.
next question is a sort of repetition, whether the European Commission Task Force works with other regional blocs like ASEAN or BRICS. You've already mentioned you spend a lot of time in China. Do you work with closely with other countries or other regions?
Yes. So for
Mm-hmm.
ASEAN at the moment, so because within the task force, we organize ourselves in geographical areas. So myself and
Mm-mm-mm.
another colleague, we split some of the ASEAN countries. So of course we need to identify certain priorities, because it's not viable to reach out to all countries at the same time always. So the resources are limited, but within the ASEAN at the moment. So myself, I'm leading the coordination and the cooperation with Malaysia and Singapore, Thailand within ASEAN region, and plus India outside the ASEAN region. And another colleague is leading the collaboration with Vietnam and Indonesia within the ASEAN region. This
Okay, so
doesn't
that's
mean that,
extensive engagements.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah,
very
exactly.
good.
It
That's
doesn't mean that
wonderful to hear.
other countries will be excluded from talks, not at
Sure,
all. It's
sure.
just because, for example, if Philippines or other countries come up with something, we can either at regional level or at the bilateral level pick it up. So it's a dynamic process. Also keeping in
Okay.
mind that we are considering that in the third quarter of this year, in September, back to back with a ministerial on climate and environment that will take place in Kuala Lumpur between EU and ASEAN, because Malaysia has the chairmanship of
Chair of
ASEAN this year.
ASEAN, yeah.
We are planning. We have proposed, and it has received good feedback from Malaysian government and from ASEAN overall, and also from Singapore and other partners, to organize a EU ASEAN conference on carbon pricing to take place in Malaysia in the third quarter of this year. So this is like a really good opportunity in the preparation
Brilliant,
to that, to bring it all
brilliant.
together at
Okay,
regional level.
Renato, I hope you make it to KL in September. So our
Yeah, I
next
want to go
question
there before
is,
that. Yes.
okay, our next
Yeah.
question is really about ITMO's carbon credits. So internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. So do you want to opine on this?
Well, on this, as you know, I think that it's more like that there are EU member states that
Mm,
are establishing agreements with ASEAN countries. So EU
mm,
itself
mm, mm.
is not making those agreements, because EU is not using credits that will come through this mechanism for the reaching of the target, of the current target. But countries like France, Sweden, and other countries, for example, that are part of the ETS but are not a part of the EU, like Norway. Some examples, or Switzerland, that is also linked with the EU ETS, but it has its own ETS. These countries are establishing agreements as we speak with countries across ASEAN. So that's where these dynamics are at the moment. So we have a process also of monitoring these and trying to understand how these are developing, and they are materializing from the initial intentions into the operationalization, because that's an important next step.
Okay. We've got quite a few more questions and I'm running out of time.
Yes.
Understand there's a correlation, or the linkage between EU ETS and CBAM in terms of pricing. So how are you going to price? So EU ETS will be constrained within the guardrails of their demand and supply, the industries which are being picked. CBAM is going to reflect trading partners, the industries that you might want to protect or avoid leakage. So the question is, how is this going to work? How are these prices going to align with each other? And how is it going to affect exporters, local EU players for the domestic market? How is all of this going to be balanced out? Because now you've got two different pricing systems, right?
Yes. So basically, there is the UETS price, and there will be the CBAM price.
CBAM price.
So
yeah.
it's a bit difficult to say at this stage. As I said, this is a learning process for the EU also, and there is a process that proceeded until now about a lot of data collection, trying to understand. And this is going to the studies that will inform the legislative acts that will follow will be coming out in the second half of this year of 2025. So this will be quite informative. Also, there is an experts working group on CBAM, where some countries have been expressed interest to participate as observers. For example, Singapore is an observer to that expert group. So I think that it's probably keeping you one step closer to all these developments, because my colleagues from TechSud, they are very proactively dealing with this piece of legislation. Last week or the week before, there was a big conference in Paris also about the state of play of CBAM, and where the director general and the other heads of unit that are leading this policy have been giving the latest updates. So what I suggest, because this is a dynamic field, is two things. One is that if you want to engage more, considering also the possibility whether or not Malaysia can be part of this observer to the expert group, because give you more insights and more direct access to the policy making as we go. On the other hand, also, there is a dedicated kind of landing page in DG TechSud website that has lots of resources about CBAM, and some of them are translated in multiple languages. So I can also, after this call, share with you, and you can share with participants, the link directly to that page. So it's basically a repository of resources for CBAM that I believe are very useful, because sometimes people hear about CBAM from the news and from external analysts or other sources. And this is basically really a depository of a DG TechSud, where you can find the latest on CBAM.
Okay. I think I've seen what it looks like. I'm going to put this into the chat, or I can't.
I think I can also find here. I can find here the link. Just a moment.
Okay, I've just put the link in. Can you just check? Is it this one? And Avi will share it with everybody else, because apparently we can't message everybody else.
Okay. Let me see the chat box.
Is that the correct link that I've put into the chat box?
No.
No?
It's not this one. Let me check. No, this one goes to the International Carbon Pricing Diplomacy. It's a different one. I will share with that with
Could
you.
you
Just
please?
a moment.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
If you scroll, because scrolling down has CBAM as well.
Yes.
Links.
Okay. Yeah. Probably CBAM.
Maybe that's the landing page. I'm not sure. Okay. Anyway, I need to run through your next question. You can share the link with us later.
Yes,
Does the
that's
EU
that's
tech?
the one. So sorry, the other one,
Yeah.
it's fine. Yes, if you go to the other
Okay.
one, you get all the resources.
All the
The one
CBAM
that says
information.
CBAM.
Yeah.
Yes, correct.
So,
Yeah.
Avi, can you please share that in the general chat? Does the EU taxonomy conflict with free market principles? And could it potentially impede economic growth? Does the taxonomy address concerns such as greenwashing? Okay, so what do you think, Renato? Free market principles.
Yeah. So, well, again, EU legislation is EU legislation is very complex, and so the same way that the DG TaxSud is dealing with CBAM, there are also other colleagues that have been behind the EU taxonomy.
Yeah.
It's important that the development of these taxonomies creates clarity rather than confusion, creates
Okay.
predictability so that when it's defined in a way that it's not basically giving the impression that, okay, these are the rules of the game now, and then the rules of the game later are different, and then will change again and again and again. So it's
Mm,
important to keep a stable uh, set for everything to work well. And of course, I think that there are needs in this process of a policy alignment, because sometimes different policy sets come from different backgrounds and they are
mm,
sometimes not originally fully aligned. And that's why some of them require improvements, reforms, etc., to avoid
understand.
contradictions. But
Understand.
also there is the process of simplification that I mentioned before. And so when
Yeah.
we look at all these, it's important sometimes that things get simplified to the
Mm,
sense that they can work better through simplification, but not
mm,
simplifying to the point that it means that they are watered down to a point where they become effective and then no longer work. So it's kind of
Yeah.
finding that
Yeah.
point that it's quite important, and this is what colleagues that are responsible for these legislative packages are currently looking at and trying to understand
Yeah.
how much red tape is there and how much is needed to be
Yeah.
improved. Yeah,
Simplified.
these kind
Yeah,
of things.
absolutely. So many things to balance. And also
Yeah,
remember,
yeah,
it's a fast-moving space. The paradigms are shifting all the time. And you don't want to be so onerous that you're going to impede innovation or progress, especially economic progress, right?
exactly.
Um, we have a few more questions. Many countries are making it compulsory for listed companies to start reporting their emissions. What about private companies? Okay, I mean, I think this is, yeah, it's quite
Yeah, well, there are private companies that might not be necessarily
much bigger
listed.
than listed companies. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
understand.
yeah. So, but I think, as
Okay,
you mentioned, there is also a trend globally in terms of ESG and others, that some
yeah, yeah,
companies, even non-listed companies, they decide to doing it themselves because they see the benefits
yep,
of
yep,
doing
yep,
it.
yep, yep, yep.
I think what
Understand.
is important again is making sure, because you might be talking about very small or micro private companies, and where
Yeah,
it becomes suddenly a very high burden for these companies
yeah,
compared with the benefit, or you'll be talking
understand.
about the very large private companies that are
Private
not listed.
companies. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
I think what's happening, Renato, is that this is an instance where regulators, for example, the central bank or capital market regulators, are actually ahead of policymakers.
yeah,
So capital market regulators are imposing conditions on listed companies to disclose their emissions reporting. Because capital markets are forward-looking, allocators of
yeah,
capital, investors want to know, are you part of the solution or not? But
yeah,
policymakers haven't caught up yet. So they
yeah.
haven't mandated emissions reporting, not based on size of company, but based on your carbon footprint. So
Mhm.
you might be a relatively small company, for example, operating a landfill that's got huge carbon emissions, especially methane, and you're not being picked up, right? And you're not listed.
Yeah,
So I think
yeah,
that's
yeah.
that's the gap. It's just that regulators are ahead of policymakers right now. That's why
Yeah,
you
and
have
it's
that
very
gap.
important to know these dynamics, because in many
Yeah,
countries, and that's
yeah,
why when we engage as a task force, we also engage with businesses,
yeah,
with different
yeah.
stakeholders, because we know that
Yeah.
sometimes um, the businesses can be the driving force, and other sectors can be
Mm,
the driving force, and can provide very good practical recommendations to the legislators to move faster and to unlock some of some of the issues. So because in this case, like access to financing and credit might be a determining factor for some companies to do it or not do it. So it creates some conditionality.
So that's exactly the role that climate governance Malaysia is trying to play. We're trying to mobilize private sector. And with this revolving door, with policymakers and regulators, we keep giving them feedback. Okay, palm oil industry. I'm not sure if you would know about the palm oil industry. I know EUDR, okay. I think we can ignore. Let's just ignore.
Yeah, I don't.
because I think
I
that's not
must
your.
confess. I don't. I don't have
That's not
background
your.
on that
Okay,
one.
okay.
Yes.
Apologies. Okay, so there's a question from Mazli because you had mentioned earlier high quality, low quality VCM projects, right? So just maybe when you say high quality or low quality, what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So basically, is projects that with a higher level of integrity, that are truly additional. That's very important. The additionality of the projects, the environmental and social safeguards of the projects. So these are very important aspects that will determine the quality of these, because what can be very risky for this market is that there and there is also a natural risk that in this transition, for example, into Article 6 after Baku, that some of the lower quality projects might be recycled into Article 6. And that what we'll do is that will create a volume of projects, a bigger pipeline, but not taking into account for the quality. So as I mentioned, putting the quality as a primary criteria versus the quantity of volume traded. It's quite important to guarantee that the market is robust. What is important is that the way the regulations, or if there is a steering groups and there are different steering bodies that have to go through the project cycle and the approving or rejecting at some point, it's done in a robust way that it can be, again, without creating excessive regulation or legislation, but that it can truly work as a filter to separate a good project from a bad project, because few bad projects can easily undermine the credibility of the system, and
As we've already seen.
it will take much more good projects to reverse the story. And so that's why I think it's really important that we are all acknowledging that the quality is a must, and we all benefit
critical.
because if you are selling and the market trusts that quality is coming from there, from a seller, you can sell at a higher price. If you are buying, you know that you are buying is of good quality, and you prefer to pay a premium or a slightly higher price for credits coming from a project that give you those guarantees than rather paying a discounted price for something that down the line is valuing very little to nothing.
Absolutely. Because it all goes back to the integrity of your decarbonization claims, right?
Yeah.
When you're saying you're decarbonizing, what does it mean? But you had also touched on quality quantity when you were in your presentation, your opening remarks when you were speaking about China. So EU ETS largest by volume in the world, but China larger by emissions. So do you want to speak about the quality of the Chinese ETS market?
Yeah. So in that slide, I was talking about because in China, I was talking about the volume of the regulated market. So, but the domestic market is by default bigger because of the size of the Chinese economy, and because they are also covering, let's say, similar sectors that are also, in terms of sectoral scope, that is quite similar, but several times bigger than EU. But at the same time, China itself is developing a voluntary carbon market. There was a bit of a stop and go. So there was the market of CCERs, and this voluntary market that is complementary to the national ETS coexists. So again, this is something that it's also interesting for Malaysia, that in the process of eventually starting a domestic compliance market, that might give an extra boost for the domestic voluntary market, because it, depending of course on how things are designed, that you might consider that a certain percentage for compliance with domestic can be achieved via use of credits from the voluntary market itself within Malaysia. So this is a model that that China uses, and so the reason that why they stopped the market and then they restarted over a year ago, it was to review some methodologies, review the governance structure of the voluntary market, and making sure that both methodologies and governance structures were much more robust and they would not undermine the credibility of the voluntary market and the credibility of the compliance market. So it's also a very important lesson.
Okay. Now, you had mentioned that part of the revenue stream was going to be used to help decarbonize certain emissions-intensive industries, and perhaps in a form of a social impact fund, which would help mitigate physical risk to the vulnerable. Could you elaborate on this a little bit more? What's happening in the EU?
Yes. So for the social climate fund, so indeed there are several aspects, and I would say that when EU ETS was first designed and implemented 20 years ago, there was probably not the one of the top concerns of the legislator, the underlying social impacts or the social aspects of the ETS itself. But of course, the world has changed, the world has evolved, and now it became a very central aspect, because again, it's not just about the green transition, it's about promoting a green and socially fair transition. And you hear like a lot like this idea of not leaving no one behind, but most of the times the most vulnerable tend to be more impacted. And what is changing is that while through these funds, not just specific the social climate fund, but you tends to create like the redistributive effects of the ETS to make some of these corrections. But specific for the social climate fund, because the EU ETS too is a new system, and it's linked also with it's much closer linked to the households. So it has a much more direct, visible, tangible impact in the households. That's why it's being established like that, to make sure that there is a mechanism for support for the most vulnerable and affected EU citizens. And so the idea is that this fund would have a size approximately of 80.6 billion euros for the period 2026-2032. And so that's that element of social fairness, that so it's not just about putting a price on carbon. Carbon is not just a cost, but carbon can come also with a benefit to mitigate these social distortions in this case.
Okay, brilliant. Renato, thank you so much. This has been really, really useful. I'm very grateful for your time. We're definitely going to reach out to you and to DG Clima through the EU Embassy, of course. I just want to remind all our attendees here, I'm so glad we've had such a great turnout, that carbon pricing is one of the key levers that we'll be using to decarbonize businesses and industries and economies around the world. And just to remind us all that we might be seeing an apparent pause in sustainability ambition, or specifically climate ambition, but is the momentum inexorable? Yes, I think so. Are physical risks increasing in frequency and intensity? Absolutely. Is investing in climate resilience a zero regret decision? I think so. And pricing carbon is one of the key things that we're all going to have to do. So thank you so much, Renato, for your time. I look forward to seeing you in KL, preferably before September. And take care. See you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank you so much, Mr. Renato and Datin Sri Sunita, for the enlightening session. Ladies and gentlemen, with this, we officially conclude Carbon Pricing and Markets, EU Insights and Implications for Malaysia. This session has been recorded and will be made available on the Climate Governance Malaysia YouTube channel, complete with time tag content and accompanying blog posts. Thank you to all of you for joining us today. Please take a moment to complete our feedback survey, as your feedback will be most helpful in shaping future initiatives. As Malaysia prepares to take on the ASEAN chairmanship in 2025, we're excited to announce the return of the third edition of the National Climate Governance Summit, set to take place at Sasana Kijang, Kuala Lumpur from 7th to 11th April. The summit will be held alongside the ASEAN Finance Ministers Meeting and the ASEAN Investment Conference. This year, NCGS will spotlight transition finance as a key enabler of ASEAN's sustainable future, and focus on Malaysia's leadership in driving this agenda as ASEAN chair. We invite you to stay engaged with us through our CGM newsletter and our official LinkedIn page for continued updates, including latest news about NCGS 2025. We also invite corporations to join our Friends of CGM program, designed to support businesses in advancing climate governance and sustainable business practices. You are welcome to scan the QR code for more details. Together, let's continue driving change and shape a more sustainable future. Thank you and see you next time.